Good
Well,
afternoon.
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime. We're lucky to have you.
Yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
I'm the Sustainable Food Programs Coordinator, and today we have an AMA with Jackie Rodríguez. And I wanted to introduce Guillermo real quick, and then we'll also hand it over to Jackie, and then we can launch into any questions.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Guillermo Ortiz. I'm the Sustainability and Diversity Educational Programs Manager. But more important than that, I'm a very good friend of Jackie. And so I'm glad that she graced me with her presence on a Zoom call coming all the way from the East Coast at the moment. So I appreciate Jackie for attending. We started these AMA series to really get a perspective on different areas of sustainability. And I'm really glad for the perspective that Jackie's offering in this space. So Jackie, I'll turn it over to you just to give yourself a little background, and then we can kind of jump into the conversation as it occurs naturally.
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Rodríguez, and I'm actually originally from LA, even though I'm currently based in DC. And I went to UC Irvine for undergrad and then did my master's in education policy at Urbana-Champaign, which is where I met Chen, where I see he's here today. So hi, Chen. And then from there, I moved to Washington, DC and kind of, worked at had different policy jobs, mostly in higher education, which is kind of how I met Guillermo. And also because Latinos here in DC, we kind of, try to just congregate and also help one another out. But I'm currently now working at a public relations firm here in DC called Finsbury Glover Herring, or FGH for short, which are all really tongue twisting names. And there I mostly work, supporting different clients across, the country, but also the globe, in their communications, and specifically, clients in the energy and sustainability sector. And so, some of my favorite clients, for example, are the ones working on biomaterials. So definitely have kind of some experience there working on not only, sustainable materials, but also understanding kind of also the chemical process that goes behind that. And then, when I'm not working on my free time, as you all may be aware already, I am very passionate and, love talking about sustainable fashion and also helping anybody out, that maybe have an interest or an inkling in like how to get started. But happy to be here and like answer any questions that you may have.
Yeah, I'll kick us off. So I know, Jackie, you mentioned that you kind of entered from a world of education policy, but also had this passion for climate. How did that for you evolve from a passion in your own personal settings to a career to then also engaging on social media on sustainable fashion issues? What was the kind of impetus for you really jumping into that space and being interested in exploring that industry and ways that it can be improved?
Yeah, I hate and love this question just because like there was so many different inputs that like kind of, naming that one particular moment or kind of just, really defining that evolution sometimes is a little bit difficult. But as I mentioned, I come more from an education policy and specifically was very much focused, even though I did higher ed, more on workforce issues and talking more about like economic equity and also wealth building equity. And so I think as, naturally the climate change conversation has just, kind of, garnered more attention in the media, but also, we've all just become much more aware for obvious reasons. I think the component about environmental justice, but more specifically about like labor justice really kind of was always top of mind for me. And so as I was working here in DC and thought about my policy work, I kept thinking about how climate change was kind of at the time really not, I think, having a focus on environmental justice. The conversation at the time, I felt that it was a little bit centered a lot more on economic issues at a more macro level, like as a country's economy versus people's day-to-day living. And so I think that really made me really interested in exploring climate change from that perspective, and then kind of, moving more into climate change as a field, and also coming at it not so much from a policy perspective anymore, but coming from it also from a communications perspective. And then I think from a personal level, I think having grown up in a Salvadorian working class family, it also just, from from being, very young, it made me very conservative in terms of spending, but also very just naturally sustainable without knowing or like meaning it in that way. And sometimes I even question myself, like, am I being really frugal and I'm just like making the excuse that I'm being sustainable? Or, am I kind of masking my cheapness for sustainability? But regardless of that, I still think, it's like I think conserving and consuming less is always like a great way to think about your sustainability. And so I think, my background from my family and just kind of my career progression helped me. And just how the climate change was evolving kind of just more nationally at a global level, I think just naturally kind of just made sense for me to make that transition, both at, career wise, but also then just made me then start thinking about things that kind of would empower other people. I think not only in my local community, but my peers or my friends to start thinking about climate change from a perspective that felt very relatable. And to me, obviously that became like fashion, just because that's one of the things that I, stereotypically as a woman absolutely love. And so it became, I think, very easy for me to talk about climate change and sustainability in that way.
I wondered, with being from LA and the fashion scene in LA, does that really also come into effect? I know we're doing this event really in conjunction and right to push back against this fast fashion that's kind of popped up in the industry and the environmental damages that has occurred. Now, with growing up in LA, do you feel like what was your kind of engagement with the fashion industry before, and then kind of coming into this context of educating yourself as a consumer, but also looking at it at a macro level, which just seems like you've kind of looked at it at both perspectives. And can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, LA, I think definitely had a influence in me becoming very much interested in sustainable fashion. So I hate admitting this, but I remember really early on when I was working in DC, I used to tell my friends how I felt so sometimes muted, or felt that I had to not only mute myself sometimes in the way I professionally spoke, but also just professionally appeared, like the type of clothes I had to wear or the style. I felt that it was all very too corporate-y for me. And I think that's ultimately kind of in the very beginning what made me kind of interested in looking for a more creative wardrobe that was also professional. And as I think as I kind of snowballed into that, I started and, clearly coming across that the only option that I really had were fast fashion options. And, having a labor policy background, I naturally then thought like, well, that's not something I definitely want to buy or support, from a worker's perspective and, garment worker perspective. And so I think coming from LA definitely made me, if anything, if I don't know if to call it vain, but interested in having a more creative wardrobe, regardless of kind of what field I operated in. But it also made me think helped me have a more working class and also worker perspective, in the sense that when we think about LA, or when we think about garment workers and fast fashion, we often think about workers in the global south, like, workers in India working for like $1, a month for like producing much of our clothes. But the reality is that many garment workers are actually in LA. Like LA, if anything, has many garment worker issues. Fashion Nova, if anything, has their manufacturing plants there. And I'm sure many of you may have seen in the media, they've been notorious for worker, garment wages issues. And so that definitely evolved my thinking in terms of, how could I then use fashion to not only intrigue and engage, peers or friends in LA, and also speak to an issue that was also very close to us, not only because of where we live, the proximity, but also just because like many of our parents, like, were either farm workers, were either garment workers, were just basically working class individuals. So that's kind of, I think, how, LA really did give me that unique experience and perspective. And I think someone has their hand up, or someone in the chat also. I don't know.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you have your hand up and ask your question.
Hi, Jackie.
Hey, Chen, how are you?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Good, thank you.
So earlier you had mentioned chemical processes, and that just got me thinking back to the situation with the Delta Airlines workers, where they introduced that new uniform, and there were quite a few employees that had adverse reactions to the uniforms. And when communicating with the employers of those issues and wanting to form workarounds where they could operate on their day-to-day without negatively impacting their health, for whatever reason, Delta decided to push back and not show empathy and didn't appear to have any process in place for like issues with their clothing. And so from that perspective of like the chemical process, have you seen that in industry? Are there discussions around those types of scenarios? And have you experienced, or are there conversations going on with, handling those types of situations? Is that something that's even considered when you're manufacturing clothes at a large scale for different organizations, and we run into these scenarios that can cause health effects? And then I was
Yeah,
also curious about just your own thoughts on it as well, your own feedback and how you felt about it.
yeah, to be honest, I'm not quite as familiar with that Delta situation, but just in terms of answering your question of like having, any awareness in terms of how, usually businesses or any material suppliers think about the chemicals that they're using in their clothing, that really is becoming a much larger issue within not only the fashion industry, but just the apparel industry more wider. Like when we think about not only like our clothes, but also our shoes, also, like our furniture, or, when we think about our carpet, anything that's really kind of within the textiles industry that's made from polyester, which is essentially, fossil fuels, petrochemicals, and oil and gas. Those are usually, I think now, because of climate change and, consumer demand for more sustainable options, a consideration that a lot of businesses and specifically material suppliers are considering, and how they can kind of present alternative materials, essentially sustainable materials to consumers. And so a lot of businesses, that I work with, they definitely partner with different global brands, and even brands such as like H&M, which, I think we all kind of know is notorious and infamous as a fast fashion brand. And they do, have a lot of work to do, but I think at the same time, being able to partner with a global brand also gives you kind of the ability to have impact at scale and provide better materials to the consumers that are non-toxic, that are either plant-based or that are renewable, and kind of support like a circular economy, and that don't support kind of the economy that we have within fashion that is very linear, like a make, use and dispose. We can kind of create materials that are just healthy, not only for the environment, but ourselves. And also kind of we can reuse again, either by breaking them down to make new fabrics and materials, or just kind of biodegrading them.
Yeah, I'm gonna, Kara, I see your hand up, and then after that, it's Briston Jones has a question in chat. So Kara, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, hi, my name is Kara. I wanted to ask Jackie, because I'm from LA as well, so I'm pretty sure you're gonna know where I'm talking about. But I just wanted to know, do you feel as though the Santee Alley is being taken advantage of, not only as like it's just a group of like small business owners, but also racially, because you are Latina, and I know like most of the business owners there are Latina or Latino, whatever. And yeah, I just want to know how you felt about that. I'm not sure how they go about their waste, but I feel like they reuse a lot of their stuff and like turn it into fabrics and all that type of stuff to remake it. So I just wanted to know how you felt about Santee Alley. Oh, and for those of you who do not know, it's just a few streets in downtown where you can shop, buy materials, buy gowns, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, so I think what's happening in Santee Alley is not only very specific to Santee Alley, but kind of unfortunately, also happening in, LA County more largely, but also in kind of many major cities, across the US, which is basically gentrification. And due to that, I think a lot of businesses are being pushed out, as we are seeing in the Santee Alley. And that is really unfortunate because, as you mentioned, a lot of those businesses not only are like small and businesses of color, but also they tend to be more sustainable, not because, you know, they have maybe, they don't necessarily have the technology or all these innovative materials that many other manufacturers may have, but they're producing at a much smaller scale and directly to a consumer, that their ecological footprint just isn't as, you know, as comparable to, for example, if H&M all of a sudden builds their headquarters there, or their manufacturing headquarters there. So I think what's happening there is unfortunate. And I think that's just more largely kind of like a symptom of gentrification and, you know, how we think about, you know, LA specifically, like being from their development in the region. When we think about like not only housing, but real estate development, a lot of these buildings and, you know, acres are being bought so that skyrise building can like be built. And of course, that is nice at the same time for many people that like move into cities. You know, I myself live in a major city, but at the same time, I think there needs to be taken, you know, which is why I always say like a component of equity and like economic justice about like, how can we transition over to whatever economic, you know, model that we're moving to, or system, or, you know, whatever neighborhood redevelopment we're building, but also take into consideration also the, you know, the actual community or the people that, you know, are native and, you know, to the region as well.
I'll read off the question in chat. This is from Kristen Jones. She's here with her class, Writing to Save the Planet, a communications class here at UC Merced. She'd love to know if you have any anecdotes about how college-age students can use the platforms they have to communicate about fast fashion and other sustainability issues.
And I can just jump in too and add, hi Jackie, thanks so much. So anything, we're basically in a class where our students will be producing creative messaging, whether that's podcast, whether that's, you know, artwork, whether that's creating, you know, Instagram posts about what issues they're passionate about. And actually a lot of the students have already said fast fashion is the #1 environmental issue that they're really excited about. So thank you so much for visiting us. So I love that your Instagram handle was actually in the sort of blurb about this talk. So I'd love to hear, you know, anything that I know that for this generation, there's so much sort of like climate terror and sadness all the time. So what are maybe some positive, empowering things that they can do with their communication to make a difference?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of just up to them and listening to them. I feel like if anything, you know, I now feel so much older to many people in college, but you know, the majority of like college, you know, students and like Gen Z know where their audiences are and know where they're on. And I think it's important for them to speak or like use a platform where their audience is, or that is also most natural to them. So for example, a lot of people have asked me like, how come I don't use TikTok? And I think TikTok, and I do use it. I use TikTok, I think more as a consumer, as a user, to like watch different videos. I find it very entertaining. I find it very educational. But as to create content, I find it to be too overwhelming for me. Like I don't find it to be very intuitive. And so that's just not the platform for me, although it is a platform that I definitely consume content in. So I would just recommend to use a platform where you know you can reach the people you're trying to reach, but also is very easy for you to create content. So on TikTok, I would be able to like reach definitely, you know, like the people who I want to talk to, but it wouldn't be easy for me to create content. So then I wouldn't be very successful there in like, you know, putting out content either on a frequent basis or content that I feel would be authentic to me. Instagram, on the other hand, although they're pushing on Reels a lot, is a platform that feels more natural to me. Like I can post a picture and then post a caption and explain what I'm trying to say, or like make an explainer. Or like, for example, a podcast or this type of forum feels very natural to me, like where I can have a conversation with like a group of people. So I would say it would be like basically, you know, a medium and platform and a message that resonates with your audience and also is just authentic and, you know, true to who you are as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh, we got a raised hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a question in regards to making the best use out of the clothing that we already have. I have to admit, I haven't done any research myself with regards to reuse of my own clothing, but I wanted to know if you know of any organizations or groups that like help with finding ways to remix your clothing, or if there are places where you could take your clothes and have them, change, forward fashion them into forms that would kind of be more suitable to what people wear today, but then are just reusing those fabrics as opposed to going to a store and purchasing brand new things.
Yeah, so one of the biggest one is ThreadUp, and I can write it here in the chat. So they don't do upcycling, which is kind of what you mentioned. Like, oh, I think I wrote it directly to somebody else. And so they don't do upcycling, but what they definitely do is they basically take any donations from clothes and either sell it online. They have like a giant like online marketplace, or else every now and then I think they have like either like kind of like pop-ups, or when it wasn't before pre-COVID, they definitely were setting up pop-ups in different large retailers like Nordstrom, JCPenney. And so that's definitely a consideration to take. I will say that unfortunately, I feel like a lot of options such as like ThreadUp or any huge recycling programs that are currently happening, I'm not sure that they have options for men, which is something that I think the industry is definitely working on. But I would definitely look into ThreadUp. Another one that I know is called Our Resource. They do more upcycling, and I know that basically what they do is they just like ThreadUp, where they send you a bag or a box and you put your clothing in there, and then Our Resource will basically kind of like upcycle it, or like they have different like kind of swapping events, and then they sell your clothes. So those are two that I would recommend. In terms of other ones that I know at a national level, I don't think I know any ones that are like taking clothes and then like upcycling them in any way. But many large retailers are starting to do recycling programs like H&M, like Adidas. I know DSW will take shoes that are not even shoes that they sold. And so those are always options to look for. And if not, what I usually do is sometimes I just try to find the contact information of like a store, like a large retailer, and I just ask them if they have any plans. And sometimes I have actually gotten a response, and they have said, oh, that's not something we've considered, but we're definitely going to consider it now. And so I think that's also a good way to kind of get like brands like moving on the issue.
Awesome. Thank you, Jackie.
And I'll write in the chat here the brands that I mentioned.
I guess one question I've had is, since you've kind of journeyed into the space of social media and Instagram, and developing this passion, have you had the opportunity to kind of engage with these brands as you've kind of built up your online presence? And if so, how have those conversations been? Have they been positive? Are they searching for kind of to understand sustainably conscious consumers a little bit more? What's your take on that from your engagement so far?
When you say these brands, what brands do you mean?
Well, I guess, I'm thinking especially in I think we've mentioned H&M, for example. Like, has anyone, I know these are larger companies, for example, so has anyone from either their social media accounts or from their corporate offices said, hey, we see your content, like, let's have a conversation? Or has it been more on the small business, individual shops, et cetera, that you feel like the engagement and conversation has been productive? Just trying to get a sense of where you feel the corporate or even the business side of the industry is really reaching out to you.
Yeah, so when it comes to like really large retailers like H&M, Zara, Shein, any of those, yeah, those usually reach out to like anyone who has over like 100K. So I haven't been reached out by them specifically, but I have been reached out, for example, with other, companies such as like ThreadUp, or most of the time what I usually get approached by is more smaller sustainable businesses. And even then, I personally, because I'm not on social media to make to be an influencer as my first source of income. I do have like a full-time job that already takes so much of my time, because that's not my kind of my reason for being on social media. It's more for sharing information. I try to be very, very, I think, just picky about who I end up, promoting. And for the most part, because for me, sustainable brands that are just starting out, that's, I think, definitely important to support if they definitely are producing quality items and have like a great mission behind them. But for me specifically, it's also important to support businesses of color and within the sustainability industry. So anytime like a Latinx business or Black owned business or any other business of color approaches me that has a sustainable product that aligns with my values, I definitely help them out. When it comes to other more sustainable brands, it ultimately comes down to like if I feel like they're greenwashing or not. For the most part, I don't feel like they are. But usually that's kind of, I think, the judgment value that I take into consideration when thinking about like what brands to consider partnering with or promoting any of their content.
I think it's great that you bring up greenwashing, especially I know that's a huge thing really across a lot of different industries who claim sustainable products, from the cleaning supply, janitorial supply industry, and then you're trying to, as a consumer, navigate what certifications are real, what is something that you just bought, slapped on your package. How do you, as a consumer, go around and intelligently kind of navigate greenwashing and finding products that are truly sustainable or are actually mission driven in this day and age when I feel like the common phrase, right, is that there's no ethical consumption under capitalism. How do you inject your ethics in your morality as you shop as a consumer?
Yeah, and I mean, and for anyone that's not aware, greenwashing is essentially where a business is just marketing, sustainability, but really isn't doing anything like actionable or anything real or tangible. They're just essentially, it's more PR and marketing than anything real. But the way I think I always suss it out is I think it's important to really understand the issue, like in terms of climate change and what the problem is. Because I think if then you don't understand like what the problem is within, sustainability or what's causing climate change, then it's hard for you to really kind of then consider like, is this brand really like about it or not? And so like when I think about, for me, what's important, what's contributing to climate change, and I consider that, the majority of climate change is, as a result of carbon emissions and the fossil fuel industry, then that helps me kind of have like an understanding of then kind of what to look out for whenever I see any kind of sustainability pledge and sustainability kind of commitment, or any brand that's saying that they're sustainable. So for example, anytime that I see numbers associated, like real targets, like if they're saying we plan to reduce like X percentage of carbon like emissions from our operations, and by like a very specific date, and then say how they're going to do it, that to me says that like they clearly understand the problem, and they're clearly doing something that's very real and tangible. The other way that I also kind of take out on greenwashing is like if the language just feels very clear to me, like I can understand what they're saying. It doesn't feel like a lot of jargon, a lot of marketing, like flowery language. Like, when you're writing an essay, you're BSing it. So does it feel that way or not? So if it doesn't feel that when you're reading it and it's real, then like that's just it should feel something that you should understand. I think the other way, that's probably one of the most common and like helpful ways to look through greenwashing is to look through numbers, look for like language that just makes sense, and see anything that like any real action that they're doing. Like, is it like, are they changing their materials? Are they changing their packaging? Are they changing, which would be radically different, and most businesses probably wouldn't do this, but like, are they changing their like purchasing and, selling cycles? Like, are they reducing the amount of clothes that's out there? I think those are all real ways to kind of look through the greenwashing versus like, oh, we just put out a new green product. And it's like, what does green really mean? Or like, why are you selling a product? Maybe that's really not necessary either. That's just creating more consumption for people versus, kind of helping really the issue at hand.
Yeah, getting a lot of love in chat. Aaron, I know we've had some questions that were emailed in for Jackie. Would you mind reading off one or two?
Yeah, certainly. I was actually gonna see if I could do that. So one question, I don't know if you can answer this, but someone had a question about sustainable clothing stores specific to Merced, maybe. This is from Daniela Foster. Daniela, if you're here, if you wanted to elaborate on that. Otherwise, if anyone is in Merced and had some ideas for sustainable fashion locally, that would be really helpful too.
I don't know UC Merced specifically, but I will say whatever thrift store is in your area, other than choosing not to buy, your thrift store is going to be your best option. Because it is, one, not only is it going to be super cost effective and cheap, two, you're ensuring that like that clothes doesn't ultimately end up like in a landfill waste, which is like a huge problem also within the fashion industry. And three, you're giving a new life to that product as well. So you're essentially kind of increasing its lifetime and ensuring that like that stays, in use and doesn't end up, going to a landfill. So I would just say like wherever you are, rather than, I think there's also like a really good pyramid out there that I'll find the link and try to drop it in here in terms of thinking about like your sustainable purchasing options. I always say that maybe the first option or the best option isn't to just look for a sustainable brand, although I think a lot of sustainable brands are doing great things. But usually it's like to maybe not buy anything at all if it's something you don't really need. And if it is, looking for it secondhand. And then, if you can't find it secondhand, then looking for a sustainable brand. And so I think having more of a mindset in place of how you approach your shopping is usually a little bit more helpful, I think, than trying to see like what's the best sustainable brand out there. But of course, sometimes you always need something new, sustainable. So the other thing that sometimes I do when I need something new, but want it to be ethically aligned, is I also try to go on Depop or Poshmark online, or even eBay, and try to find it secondhand there, or try to find a used on pre-sale, on resale. And the other really good option that is out there, I think, and probably UC Merced has probably a really good Facebook Marketplace. That's kind of where I just moved into a new place, and that's essentially where I almost bought all of my furniture from. So I think Facebook Marketplace, even though Facebook has issues for other reasons, their marketplace is one reason why I keep it.
Awesome, thank you. There's another really good one that came in. How do we make sustainability more accessible to lower income people? Eco-friendly choices are accessible to financially stable folks. I'm also putting that in the chat if you want.
Yeah. So this is something that I love saying, like, if something's too expensive for you, it's not for you. So if you feel like the best sustainable option out there is too expensive, and like, this person kind of pointed out, it's out of reach, then that, you shouldn't feel guilty or, guilt tripped into having to buy that. If you can't afford it, that also, shouldn't be a reason why you should feel forced to buy, X sustainable option. I think there's also great other options, like trying to buy it secondhand. And even then, I think many people are like, well, what if I can't find it secondhand? What if like my only option is like, at the time, let's say I have a job interview, and like the best thing and easiest thing that I have right now is like Target. I think if you're buying that one, blazer for that interview, and it's the one time you shop that Target, I think that's also absolutely okay. So I like to, if anything, say like for low income people, I think the threshold is different. And I think we shouldn't feel forced to to have to buy into sustainable options because we're contributing to climate change. I think ultimately if we're making for the most part like great choices and we happen to have within our means the ability to only buy, you know, let's say the Target blazer or some Target option, then I think like that's totally fine. I don't think, you know, it would be very different if we're like every other weekend shopping at like Target and buying like Target hauls of all these products. So I say it's best to always approach your sustainability within your means as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Here's another good one too. What did you do to get to this point in your career? As in, go by steps on how you achieved what you currently do now.
Well, that's quite a journey, Jackie.
I was like, I'm old, you guys. I love how this person said, go by steps. Like, don't just tell me, like, go by step. I feel like I would also ask a question like that. Honestly, I got, as I mentioned earlier, my getting here was very circuitous. So I went to go step by step. I went to undergrad at UC Irvine. I did my undergrad in sociology. And I did that because I thought I wanted to go to law school and I didn't want to do political science. So I did sociology, and also because in sociology where all my socialist teachers were at, and I loved them. And so from there, then once I graduated and was close to graduating, I clearly decided that law school wasn't for me, but I didn't know what I wanted to do next. And because I was doing college counseling during undergrad, I thought, and as you know, every immigrant we have in our head, like, or like our parents definitely instill in us that education is the most important thing. I was like, well, you know, education, let me focus on that. Let me focus on education policy. And so then I went and got like my master's in education policy. And then I thought like, oh my God, I want to move to DC and have a big girl job, you know, be like this basically like Glen Coco of higher ed, you know? And so I got here and I realized that's really not what I was passionate about. And I think it was because ultimately I was missing, like, I want something where like culture and like this intersectionality of like culture and also communications, which I didn't know at the time, and also like a economic and social issue that I clearly care about. And so from there, I worked from like, I think almost like a consulting job to another consulting job until I finally worked like at a think tank and called the Bipartisan Policy Center here in DC. And in that think tank, I was working on paid family leave. And that's kind of where I felt a little bit more like, okay, I feel like this aligns more with me in terms of, you know, being more aligned with worker issues, you know, with sustainability, but in a way that isn't like sustainability from the aspect of talking about like workforce sustainability, like how do we actually give women, and not only women, actually parents across the board, like the policies that they need to actually be able to take care of their children and like have children and also create a much more sustainable workforce. And so I think having kind of that mindset is ultimately then what just opened the door for me to think about sustainability more largely from like an economic scale. Like clearly sustainability is important to climate change, but also how is it important to people of color? How is it important to our economic policies when it comes to worker rights issues? How is it important to housing? And, you know, kind of picking a lane there. And then I realized, you know, what I really care about is clearly policy, but not doing it from like a very traditional policy perspective, like the research and writing the memos. Like that was so boring to me. It was about like making people aware of the issues and helping, you know, like helping raise like a public awareness. And so I clearly then was like, oh, I need to do communications and I care about sustainability a little bit more largely. And so that's ultimately how then I jumped into working at a public relations firm now, where I am and working very specifically in the energy and sustainability practice and working with businesses that are, you know, trying to do actual that I can actually say are good, doing good in the world, but also working for, you know, many organizations and helping them kind of raise their advocacy efforts. And so that's kind of ultimately how I ended up here. And then, and yeah, that's kind of been my little crazy life story. Chen, I think you have your hand up. Go ahead.
All right, I'm gonna make this quick since time's running out. But you had mentioned biodegradability, and for me, I just instantly thought, okay, biodegradable clothing. Like, as much as I think that's cool, I would freak out about getting a biodegradable like outfit because I would worry that it would just destroy itself and disintegrate in the wash. In your experience, like, have you run into any clothing products that are like that, or is it kind of more along other products? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah. No, that's such a good point because the other day I was thinking about that too. It's silly to think about it, but that's not how biodegradability works at all. When a product is biodegradable, it still has to go through like a chemical process. So like for example, if let's say clothing is biodegradable, that essentially means that it can basically after time and after like going through a very either like when you like bury it or whatever. I don't know the exact technicalities, but once it goes through a very kind of fermentation, for lack of a better term, process, will it then disintegrate? But it has to go through that like process. With other products that are like, biodegradable, sometimes they can either be broken down mechanically or broken down chemically. So they have to, go through a whole manufacturing process in terms of like breaking, apart the fibers or, going through a chemical process where essentially the materials and fibers can then be turned down to their virgin materials. Like let's say if you have polyester, it can be turned down into plastic that it can be reused. Or if you have cotton, it can be turned down into like a cellulose. So it still like has to go through a very specific process in order to then to basically break down. It's not going to break down in your washing machine. You yourself most likely will not be able to break it down. Or like you probably have to like, bury it in a very specific way. Like a lot of food, is biodegradable, but it's like, obviously, you see food, it goes through a whole process till it finally like breaks down.
Thank you. Here's another really interesting one too that came in. What type of legislative processes could we approach when trying to curtail the production of fast fashion?
Legislative processes can we approach? Breaking down capitalism. No, but like if we think about fast on a serious note, if we think about
swinging
fast
for the
fashion,
fences on that one.
what?
I said swinging for the fences on that one, right?
Yeah. No, on a serious note, if you think about fast fashion, like in the word fast, it's about like the issue, fast fashion has a lot of issues, but one of the main issues is its manufacturing and, basically manufacturing, but also purchasing and selling cycles. So, for example, like Forever 21, Shein, and all these other companies sell like, 42 different, what is it that they usually call them? Like, they basically are selling clothes like around the year, like at like fast volumes. Every week they have like new styles in the store. And so if we think about like how can we kind of de-escalate that and like the degrowth process of that, those are kind of more like regulatory practices like this person kind of mentioned that need to be checked. And so one way that can kind of that like rampant pace of like their growth of always constantly wanting to grow at scale and sell at scale, the ability that allows them to do that is the fact that one, they don't pay great worker wages, so that allows them to sell like volumes of clothes at a really, really cheap price because that's where they're saving their money. Two is the fact that there's no regulation in terms of the quality of clothing that they have to put out. There's no regulation on the materials of clothing that they have to put out. And four, there's also no regulation in terms of like the energy intensity in their production, or within their supply chain. And so if all those things were regulated, like living wages, if their carbon emissions were regulated, if the materials they use within their supply chain and also their business operations were regulated, that would force them to then to slow down, I think, their manufacturing process to then be able to like produce at a scale that would be at a scale and pace that would be much more sustainable. And unfortunately here in the US, we don't have any national policy that is currently a proposal of that. New York does have, I think it's called the New York Sustainability Act, something like that. I can look it up and like share it here. I think it's called Fashion Sustainability and Social Accountability Act. And what that act essentially does is like any company that operates in New York would have to, that makes over like $100 million, which are essentially global brands, would require for them to report out on all the issues that I just talked about, but also address all those issues. So they would, for example, have to report on like, what are the living wages that they are giving to workers? And like, by when are they meeting that? And how are they meeting that? And so I think if we actually had like a national framework in that way, that would kind of help to like rampant production of like fast fashion, and it would ultimately help, you know, kind of curb climate change as well. And I think in California specifically, there's an act called also the Garment Worker like I think the Garment Worker Protection Act. And essentially that's also kind of looking at garment worker wages and making sure that garment workers aren't being kind of stolen of their wages. So those are some of the few acts that currently exist in the US, but unfortunately there's really not that many. Oh yeah. Thank you for sharing it. Erin just shared it in the chat, and I can drop the garment worker one from California.
So there's another fun question that came in from Chin actually. And they asked, are there any companies that are looking for an ambassador for slow fashion? If so, I think I'd be a great candidate.
Are there any, what, I'm sorry, what was it?
Are there any companies that are looking for an ambassador for slow fashion? If so, I'd be a great candidate.
If I know of any, Chin, I definitely will send them your way. I know there's many out there. You know, usually brands, if like you're interested in or like want to support, I think they definitely, you know, are happy to receive any support as well. So I'll definitely send those your way.
Well, one thing I was thinking about, Jackie, during our discussion here is this. I remember reading in high school and through college, like the garment industry in particular has a long history of, I mean, some of the first labor laws that like came into the United States were to address things like garment worker, like factory fires and things of that nature. So it's always been an industry known for exploiting its workers, and so it's not surprising it's also exploiting our natural resources as well. But one thing I think that is very unique about your experience, and I think it helps your analysis, was this kind of focus on labor policy that you developed as well. And the and so it's a really intersectional approach. But I mean, you and I both know DC pretty well. Everything tends to be in silos, meaning your housing people do housing policy work, your environment people do environment work, your fashion industry people, they do their fashion industry, and there's not really a lot of intersection, right? That they work together on advocating on these issues. In your opinion, what's the best way to kind of look at these overlapping areas and finding intersectional ways to create solutions? Like you mentioned, we have to talk about carbon emissions. We have to mention a livable wage, and you mentioned looking at energy intensity, right? These are different, what are traditionally different policy areas, but all kind of looked at in a comprehensive solution. So, you know, what helps you look at that and figure out ways to bring these pieces together?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm sure a lot of people here are well aware with AOC, and I feel like AOC's Green New Deal basically kind of like touched upon all those issues in terms of thinking of them holistically. And I think the framework of that was the fact that like as a economy, we need to transition to we need to decarbonize, we need to transition to cleaner energy. And as we're doing that, transitioning to cleaner energy, we need to think about like making sure that like, quote unquote, like no one's left behind, that people, for example, can afford clean energy in their homes, that people aren't left out of jobs, that people have housing. So it's really, what I really do love about working in climate change and in sustainability is that it really is not really an intersectional issue so much as like a comprehensive solution. Because if we need to think about not only decarbonizing our energy grids and making sure that we all, have clean energy sources, we need to make sure that everyone also has access to a home that can provide them clean energy sources, to a job that they are able to then be able to afford those clean energy sources, to living wages where they can actually buy the clothing that is then sustainable, to having sustainable options and choices where they don't have to, put in danger their own health, or in any way, like any other, physical circumstance or monetary circumstance either. And so I think it's really looking at like, how can we solve climate change? And I think as you're thinking about how you solve climate change, you're thinking about like, well, all these underlying things also need to go along with it. And that's just kind of how I think about it. Like, you really can't have a solution to climate change without having like a really comprehensive solution to like how you make sure like an economic system then is not only clean, but also is economic equitable, where everyone can participate in like equally in the sustainability options that you have.
Very good point. I know we're running on time. We got 3 more minutes, but is there anything you kind of wanted to share with the folks on the call as we kind of wrap up, and about your journey, or where you would like to see the industry, or an end to fast fashion in that regard?
Yeah, and to fast fashion. I think the only thing I would like people to consider more is like, I mean, fast fashion is an issue, but I think it's more about fashion more largely. Like, for example, technically speaking, fast fashion does include luxury fashion too. And so, because it's about really talking about the fact that like producing so much at scale. And so I think I would like people to kind of just like consider more like how the issue is not only with fast fashion, but the industry and different corporations that are producing so much products that then make us like consume so much, or are constantly marketing to us that then kind of influence us to consume. So of course, like I think like it's great that we, embrace sustainable options, but at the end of the day, like it's corporations that are responsible and it's our government that's responsible. So I think the message that I think I always like leaving people with, it's like, it's always great to have a sustainable lifestyle, because I think it, at least for me, it helps me remain hopeful and helps me like, sometimes feel like those little things help me cultivate a mindset that then like I can think about larger issues a little bit more intrinsically. But at the end of the day, it's also about like ensuring that like companies and our government are also doing their job, and they're also being accountable of like their actions as well.
That's great. No, thank you so much. I think we're perfect on time. So I want to thank you so much for joining us and having this conversation. I think you did a wonderful job. So I appreciate you. And anytime I get to mix business with friends, it's always a good day for me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. Go ahead. And Aaron, if you want to say anything as well before we close up.
This was fantastic. I learned a lot. Definitely eye-opening and inspiring too. So this was recorded and will be posted on YouTube and everything, and I'll share it out in case anyone wanted to review it, listen again. Thank you so much for answering all of our questions and for spending some time with us. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free and shoot us an email. Thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank
and if
you.
you have any questions, feel free to DM me too on Instagram. I'm just a DM away.
Thank you, Jackie.
Share out your Instagram
Bye.
too. I'll have that.
Take care.
Have a good one.